Schwieter here, again, your instructor for the auditory system, i.e. the ear. Just before we begin, a little bit about the difference between Spanish and English when we refer to an ear. If you look at this part of the ear, you know, we got a big one because it's kind of cool. If you look at the outside of the ear, you know, the part that you see on the outside, the cartilage, in English we call this an ear, and we call everything the ear. But in Spanish we call this part, this outward part, the oreja, and we call the rest of the auditory system the oído. So that's a small difference. Another thing I wanted to point out about ears is the difference between a child's ear and an adult's ear. Now if you look at the models here, this here is called the eustachian tube. That kind of the tube that goes to inside down your throat into your brain. And you know that children tend to get ear infections more often than adults do, and there's a reason for it. If you look at the eustachian tube in an adult, you can see that it's curved. If you look at the eustachian tube in a child, you see that it's straight. And because it's straight, it tends to trap bacteria much easier than a curved tube, because the bacteria can have a hard time traveling down a curve. They have no problem traveling in a straight line. So that's a little difference, and that's why children tend to have more ear infections, or more frequent ones, than adults. So let's go to the PowerPoint and talk a little bit about terminology. There's not a lot, but we have the tympano, which is also called the tympanic membrane. And in English, a lot of times we say eardrum. In fact, it's very common to say eardrum. You'll rarely hear people say tympanic membrane. In Spanish, I have never heard anyone call the membrane an eardrum, a bombo del oído. We usually say la membrana timpánica, or the tímpano. That's very common in Spanish, the tímpano. The other medical terminology piece you need to know is auto. Anytime you see the word OTO, it refers to the ear or the oído. So let's briefly go into overall anatomy of the ear. You have the ear canal, which is the outer part, which leads to the outside, and the tympanic membrane, like I said, they're the eardrum, and then we have some bones and structures on the inside that help not only to bring sound to our brains, but also it has to do with balance. And quickly, the outer part of the ear, or the cartilaginous part of the ear, the part that we see, it has all kinds of names for its parts. You don't have to memorize these, but I put them up there because I thought it'd be fun for you to see that there's every little part of your oreja has a name to it. And the lobule, that's where we usually pierce to put pierced earrings in, but you can pierce all the way up because it's just cartilage is all it is. If you look down there in the corner, that's what people used to use back in the old days for hearing aids. It's when hearing aids were not invented yet, and so that is a hearing aid. Aren't you glad we don't have to use those anymore? Now the middle ear we'll talk about a little bit. The middle ear has the whole structure of our auditory system, and behind the tympanic membrane we have those three bones, as you can see there. And let's look at them in Spanish now. And there's the Spanish version. The stapes, interestingly enough, is the smallest bone in the body. Just a fun fact to know. So let's talk a little bit more about the middle ear. The ossicles, or those three bones, which I'll show you here, if you would kind of cut there. They sit right here in the part of the ear. Those are the three bones right there, right in this part of the ear. So here's the auditory canal, here are the bones. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. And they, like I said, they're the smallest bones in the human body. The malleus, or the hammer, is the first one, which is attached to the eardrum, or the tympanic membrane. And it is sensitive to vibrations and pressure. The anvil, or the incus, which has the shape of an anvil, is connected to the hammer, which is connected to the membrane, and the stirrup, which is a smaller bone that follows it. And the stirrup, or stapes, because it looks like a stirrup, is connected with the incus and attached to the opening between the middle ear and the vestibule of the inner ear. So there's two, so the middle ear, that's what actually attaches the middle ear to the inner ear. So what is the function of these bones or ossicles? And what they do is they transmit sounds from the air to the fluid-filled labyrinth, which is the cochlea, which, if you want to see that right here, you can see there's fluid. This orange stuff is fluid, and that's the cochlea. Yeah. And we'll talk about this in a minute. So back to the PowerPoint. The absence of these bones would actually make you moderately or have severe hearing loss. So those bones are very important because they transmit vibration. So there's part of the inner ear, and those are the structures of the inner ear, and which also have to do with balance. We have the tympanic cavity, or the eustachian tube, which I showed you earlier. That tube that in the kid is straight and in the adult is curved. And it connects with the nasal cavity, which allows pressure to equalize between the middle ear and the throat, and it also drains mucus. So when you're in an airplane, you know, your ears pop. It has to do with that connection. The ear canal, which is the outside of the ear, that's where the sound comes from the outer ear into the eardrum. And also that area is where wax builds up. And why do we have wax in there? It's not there to plug your ear up. It's there to keep that area moist. Like right here. That's where the wax builds up, right in this area, right here before the tympanic membrane. I'll show you here. So if you go here, that's where the wax is. And I'm sure we're all familiar with wax. Okay, go ahead. Back to PowerPoint. And then we have the oval window, which transmits a motion from the eardrum to the inner ear. And this creates pressure, which actually goes to the auditory nerve, which then transmits sound to the brain. And that's how we get sound. So let's continue on. And then in a minute I'll show you the whole structure. The round window allows the fluid in the cochlea to move, which aids in hearing. And the semicircular canals send information on balance and head position. And the brain gets all this from your auditory system. And the cochlea, that little round thing that looks like a concha, is what transforms sounds into signals, which are then sent to the brain. So let me show you this. And there it is. There's that structure. And like I said before, there's the cochlea with the fluid in there, and this all has to do with balance, and then these are the nerves that go to the brain. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. And there it is. So the inner ear is a labyrinth, like we talked about before, and that has basically balance information. And I showed you where that was. And it carries sound waves to the brain, and it also that's where our sense of gravity comes. So if you have problems with your inner ear, guess what? You get what we call labyrinthitis or dizziness. So here's an overall picture of what goes on in your auditory system. There it is. Here's gross anatomy of the auditory system. So what kind of illnesses do we have in the auditory system? We have, and I'll explain all of these. Otitis, remember, oto means ear, and what does itis mean? Inflammation, right. So otitis means inflammation of the ear, and externa means on the outside. So otitis media then would be inflammation of the middle ear, right? Media. Perforation of the eardrum. These are all things. And vertigo, which is also another word for dizziness. Tinnitus, I don't know, most of you are probably familiar with that, but that's a fancy way of saying ringing in your ears. And hearing loss, which is very common, especially as you get older, in older adults, but it also happens in children, etc. So let's start with otitis externa. That's the infection of the skin that covers the outer ear canal. So bacteria is the main culprit, and usually bacteria will get in there due to water. That's why we commonly call this swimmer's ear, because when you're underwater a lot, especially in a lake or an ocean where there's a lot of bacteria, then you're going to get water sitting in there. Excuse me. And the wax is nice and moist, and you know, nice, moist, dark places create a good living place for a lot of bacteria. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Symptoms include, well, redness and swelling, which is very typical of inflammations of the outer ear canal. And you also can get discharge, which could be pus or anything like that, but something that's not normal. And yes, itching and pain. Itching is very common in inflammation, so you'll get a lot of itching and pain around there. And tenderness when your jaw moves. Gee, I wonder why that happens. Well, because of the connection of the ear canal that goes down into the jaw area, and that's why it's kind of called referred pain. And you will get some hearing loss, maybe. So how do you treat this? Well, oral antibiotics, maybe, maybe not. Ear drops or otic drops are very common. And you can use warm compresses, sweet oil, just put it in there and kind of drown the bacteria, so to speak. And sorry about that. Ibuprofen or Tylenol for pain. And if it gets severe enough, you have to go to the doctor, the eye, ears, and nose and throat doctor. Now, otitis media, which you remember is inflammation of the middle ear. You can see down there what a normal eardrum looks like and what an inflamed or pussy eardrum looks like. Or it's filled, sometimes otitis media, because of the infection, gets filled up with fluid, and that's what it looks like when you look in somebody's ear. So you got fluid in the middle ear, which becomes infected, and it could be caused by lots of things. Allergies, which tends to swell up your canals so bacteria gets trapped and can't drain, or you have bacterial viral infections, or some blockage for whatever reason of the eustachian tube. Very common in children, and remember why? Because their eustachian tube is straight, not curved. Now, if it gets bad enough and not treated, guess what happens? It perforates, it blows up your eardrum. There's a hole because the pressure gets so hard that it just bursts your eardrum. And then you get discharge from the ear. Rhea means discharge, by the way, and oto, of course, means ear. Children get it a lot. By the age of 6, 75% of children will have had at least one ear infection, if not more. And infants, about 17 to 29%. So it's pretty common, and antibiotics is usually what we use to treat it. Ear drops, warm compresses, same thing we use for the outer ear. Decongestants is very helpful, so you decrease the swelling of those tubes. And pain relievers, over-the-counter pain relievers. Okay, I got to show you something here. See this thing? Never, ever, ever put this in your ear. A Q-tip. Now, I'm sure probably all of you have done so. But the saying goes, you should never put anything smaller than your elbow in your ear. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Why, you say to yourself? Because that can happen. And believe me, in all the years that I've been working as an interpreter and as a nurse and been around the pediatric department, I have seen a lot of this. In fact, one kid came in who had used a Q-tip from a cut rate store, and the mother put the Q-tip in there and pulled it out, and the cotton part here stayed in there because it was cheaply made, and so it just stayed. So now not only did we have a perforated eardrum, but we had a wad of cotton stuck in there. That was not pleasant trying to remove that. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. So you can see what can happen. You can rupture or perforate that ear, and I've seen people stick bobby pins in their ears. Makes you want to just gag, go, ah, no. So, and usually we need surgery to repair something like this. So what are the treatments if you happen to stick a Q-tip in your ear and cause a hole? Well, we got to give you antibiotics because we don't want germs running through there. And nothing in your ear canal. And definitely go to see a specialist. And if it's big enough, then you'll have to have surgery. So let's talk about vertigo or labyrinthitis. Remember the labyrinth in the inner ear? If it gets disrupted, that fluid, it can cause vertigo or dizziness, and that is the disorder of the inner ear. And when one of these nerves that send information to your brain is inflamed, it can create this labyrinthitis or dizziness. So you get dizziness, vertigo, and with dizziness a lot of times you get nauseated, and you can have loss of hearing as well. So you don't want to have that while you're driving or using heavy machinery. There's a couple factors that can cause this. It could be infections, it could be viruses. Sometimes we don't know what causes it. So, what kinds of treatments are there? Antihistamines may help. Medications that reduce dizziness, such as Antivert, actually does help a lot. Sedatives may help, or prednisone, cortisones. Oh, good old tinnitus. How many of you have had tinnitus, or ringing in the ear, as we call it? Probably quite a few. That's when your brain thinks there's noise, but there really isn't. So it's called ringing in the ear. Sometimes people actually hear music instead of just a ringing, or sometimes even voices. And this has nothing to do with schizophrenia. This is actually your brain filling in noise when it thinks there should be noise. It can be temporary or permanent. There's people who grew up in the 60s like I did, and probably even still today, who listened to acid rock and went to concerts with really, really loud music, or people who lived in cities who were exposed to a lot of noise, such as drilling in the streets and things like that, will have hearing problems later on because the little hairs in your ear, which is called cilia, wear out with loud noises. And once they wear out, that's it. And so the more they wear out, the less hearing you have, and the more the brain will start trying to fill in where it thinks there should be hearing or noise and there isn't. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So, like I said, noises can induce hearing loss. Prolonged exposure to noise levels of 70 decibels or higher can cause hearing loss. But there are other causes, such as frequent ear infections, allergies, stress. Stress causes a lot of problems. Or you might have something in your ear or medication. Aspirin actually is a big culprit of tinnitus. So how do we treat it? Well, it depends on what caused it. If it was loud noises in the past, not much you can do about it, other than maybe get a hearing aid. But if there's other reasons, medications, decreased stress, etc., may help. So, who has hearing loss? Can I raise my hand? Anybody who is age 65 or over? 43% of people have hearing loss. So, that's almost 50%. That's a lot. And I think the older you get, you're always going to have some hearing loss because things wear out. Yep, That's not me, but it could be. So about a third of people between the 65 and 75 will have some degree of hearing loss. And it can be conductive or sensory neural. And the conductive means physical problems like movement of sound waves. So it could be blockage, perforation, anything physical problem that can cause it. The sensory ones are, like I said before, are damage to the hair cells and the nerve cells. And that could be long exposure to the environment and sound. And so basically deafness, the biggest causes are either infection, tumor, or aging. And then there's congenital deafness, which means you were born without a cochlea or whatever that causes deafness. But that's a whole nother thing. Treatments. Well, if you can't hear very well because you have a buildup of wax, for instance, I don't know how many of you have experienced that, but I have, where you get wax buildup and then the wax hardens in your ear and then they have to flush it out. And by the way, not with a Q-tip, because a Q-tip, if you stick this in your ear to get the wax out, what you're doing is you're actually pushing the wax in there and compacting it. And eventually you get this hard black wax ball, which was really gross because I know that's what they used to get out of my ears. And they have to physically flush it out. And the difference between hearing when they get the wax ball out is unbelievable. But it works. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. So I think we're ahead of ourselves. So we can remove the earwax, but I would let the experts do that. And then the other thing that we do to help are ear tubes, putting ear tubes in. And those are usually used in children when they have infections or frequent infections and their eardrum actually bursts. And so they put a tube in to help drain, and it also helps with hearing. Audimeters are what we use to check your hearing, and that's what one looks like. Earwax removal, again, don't do this at home. Let the experts do it. They don't use Q-tips. They use a little scraper thing, as you can see there, to scrape out extra wax. Specialties in the auditory system are the eye, ear, nose, and throat doctor. El doctor de los oídos, ojos, nariz, y garganta. Okay, here's a fun questions for review. What's the word for deaf in Spanish? Mudo, right? What is a eustachian tube in Spanish? There you go, la trompa de Eustaquio. You remember what that is, right? Okay, dizziness. ¿Cómo se dice dizziness en español? El mareo. Muy bien. And how about earwax? Aha, which one of those is it? Well, guess what? There's two of them. Cerumen is the fancy word for earwax. Cerumen in español. So that actually does mean wax, but so does cera. So here's some idioms for the auditory system. Do you guys know what bug in one's ear is? Well, we'll have that in class. See if you can tell me what that means. Ear to the ground? That doesn't mean you lay on the ground and stick your ear there. Play it by ear? Or my favorite, believe one's ears. I don't believe my ears. What does that mean? Interesting facts about ears. These are things that people can do with their outer ear or their orejas. Ear piercing actually began in the United States in the early 20s, not 60s, 20s. And I know in our countries you pierce ears in little girls as soon as they're born. That was not practiced widely here in the United States until very recently. I'd say probably the 80s or 90s. So traditionally in America, little girls pierced their own ears when they grew up. But in my country, as soon as you're born, they pierced your ears before you left the hospital. On girls, not boys. Okay, male piercing became popular in the 60s. That's what became popular in the 60s. Ears actually help us taste food. Look it up. Google it. Ears never stop working. what happens is the brain just shuts off transmissions. And the inner ear has more than 20,000 little hairs. But when they wear out and never come back. And then the ear bones are the smallest bones in the body, and they can actually fit on a penny. And sound travels very quickly. Oh, we went ahead of ourselves here. Wearing headphones, as probably a lot of you do, can create a great place for bacteria. It's like a little swamp. So, we're all ears, and I'll ask you if you have any questions when I see you in class.